The crystalline notes of a waltz drifted through the grand ballroom of Ashford Manor, mingling with the perfume of hothouse roses and the low murmur of aristocratic conversation. Chandeliers blazed overhead, their countless candles casting dancing shadows across silk gowns and tailored evening coats. It was the kind of evening where fortunes were whispered about in corners, where reputations could be made or shattered with a single glance, and where the rigid rules of society held sway over every breath, every step, every carefully measured word. Vivien Caldwell stood near the marble colonnade that separated the ballroom from the terrace, her gloved hands clasped loosely before her. The emerald silk of her gown caught the candlelight in waves, making her appear almost ethereal against the cream-colored walls. She had chosen this spot deliberately, away from the center of the room where dancers swirled in practiced formations, yet not so removed as to invite speculation about her antisocial tendencies. It was a delicate balance, one she had learned to navigate in the 18 months since her engagement had been so publicly dissolved. She watched the couples move across the polished floor with an expression of polite interest that masked the tumult beneath her composed exterior. Once, she had imagined herself among them, spinning in the arms of Arthur Caldwell, her future secured, her place in society unquestioned. That vision had shattered like fine porcelain dropped on stone, leaving her to pick up the pieces while maintaining the fiction that her heart remained intact. Across the ballroom, partially obscured by a cluster of matrons discussing the latest scandal involving Lord Pemberton's youngest daughter, Duke Henry Whitmore stood with a glass of champagne he had no intention of drinking. His dark eyes, the color of espresso in shadow, tracked Vivien's movements with an intensity that would have startled her had she noticed. But she never looked in his direction, never seemed to sense the weight of his attention, and perhaps that was for the best. He had promised himself he would keep his distance, that he would honor the unspoken boundaries that existed between them, boundaries created by circumstance, propriety, and the ghost of Arthur Caldwell that still seemed to haunt every room Vivien entered. Henry had known Vivien for years, though their interactions had always been filtered through the lens of social obligation and family connections. His sister Charlotte was Vivien's closest friend, a relationship that had provided him with more opportunities to observe her than perhaps was wise. He had watched her bloom from a spirited girl into a woman of remarkable grace and quiet strength, had witnessed her joy when Arthur had proposed, and had seen the light in her eyes dim when that same man had abandoned their engagement without explanation, leaving her to face society's cruel scrutiny alone. What he had never told anyone, what he barely admitted to himself in the dark hours before dawn, was that his relief at the broken engagement had been almost as strong as his fury at Arthur's casual cruelty. It made him a poor excuse for a gentleman, he knew, to harbor such feelings for his sister's dearest friend, for a woman who had been promised to another, for someone so clearly beyond his reach, despite his title and considerable fortune. The music swelled, and Henry found himself moving almost unconsciously toward the colonnade, drawn by a pull he couldn't name and wouldn't acknowledge. He told himself he was simply checking on Charlotte, who was dancing with Lord Hartley and appeared to be enjoying herself immensely. But his path took him past Vivien close enough that the subtle scent of lavender and something uniquely her reached him. "Miss Caldwell," he said, keeping his voice carefully neutral as he inclined his head in greeting. She turned, and for a moment something flickered in her grey eyes before the practiced mask of politeness settled into place. "Your Grace, I hope you're enjoying the evening." "As much as these affairs allow," he replied, surprising himself with his honesty. Most people expected platitudes from a duke, empty assurances that everything was splendid, magnificent, beyond compare. But Vivien had never been most people, and perhaps that was part of the problem. "Though I confess I find the company rather more appealing than the entertainment." A faint smile touched her lips, genuine enough to make his chest tighten. "Lady Ashford would be devastated to hear you find her orchestra lacking." "I said nothing of the orchestra," Henry countered, allowing himself the smallest hint of warmth in his tone. "The music is exceptional. It's the performative nature of these gatherings that grows tiresome. Everyone pretending to be someone they're not, saying things they don't mean, all while judging everyone else for doing precisely the same." Vivien's smile widened fractionally, and he caught a glimpse of the woman she had been before Arthur had wounded her pride and broken her trust. And here I thought dukes were supposed to uphold society's standards, not critique them. Perhaps this particular duke has grown weary of standards that serve no one but those who wield them as weapons, he said, then caught himself. This was dangerous territory, this honesty that seemed to spill from him whenever she was near. He cleared his throat, searching for safer ground. Charlotte tells me you've been spending time at the Children's Hospital in Whitechapel. That's admirable work. The warmth in her expression cooled slightly, and Henry cursed himself for the misstep. She didn't want to be admired for her charity work, as if it were some noble sacrifice rather than the genuine desire to help that motivated her. The children there deserve far more than I can offer. But yes, I find the work fulfilling in ways that... She gestured vaguely at the ballroom, at the swirling gowns and glittering jewels and carefully orchestrated social theatre surrounding them. In ways that this doesn't, Henry finished for her, understanding perfectly what she meant. She met his eyes then, really looked at him, and something passed between them, a moment of connection that felt both terrifying and inevitable. It lasted only seconds before she glanced away, her composure reasserting itself like armor sliding back into place. I should... Vivien. The voice cut through the music and conversation like a blade through silk, cold and commanding and utterly unwelcome. Henry felt every muscle in his body tense as Arthur Coldwell materialized beside them. His blonde hair perfectly arranged, his evening clothes immaculate, his handsome face wearing an expression of proprietary confidence that made Henry's hands curl into fists. Vivien had gone completely still, her face draining of color before flushing with what Henry recognized as anger, carefully suppressed beneath years of training in proper deportment. "Mr. Coldwell," she said, her voice admirably steady, "I wasn't aware you had been invited this evening." "Lady Ashford and my mother are old friends," Arthur replied with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if his presence required no further explanation. His gaze flicked to Henry, assessment and something like challenge in his blue eyes. "Your Grace, I trust you won't mind if I steal Miss Caldwell for a dance. We have much to discuss." "I'm afraid I'm not dancing this evening," Vivien said quickly, too quickly, betraying the anxiety that Henry could see building in the tension of her shoulders, the way her gloved fingers had begun to twist together. Arthur's smile never wavered, but something ugly flickered beneath its polished surface. "Nonsense. You love to dance. Remember how we used to—" "That was a long time ago," Vivien interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "And things have changed considerably since then." "Have they?" Arthur stepped closer, invading the careful distance she had maintained. "I've been thinking a great deal about our past, about the mistake I made in letting you go. Perhaps we might—" "No." The single word was quiet but absolute, and Henry felt a surge of pride at her refusal, even as he watched Arthur's expression harden. "You're being unreasonable," Arthur said, his tone shifting from cajoling to condescending in a heartbeat. "People are watching. Surely you don't want to cause a scene?" It was a threat thinly veiled as concern, an attempt to use society's expectations as leverage, and Henry felt his already tenuous control over his temper begin to fray. But before he could intervene, Arthur reached out and grasped Vivien's arm, his fingers closing around the delicate silk of her sleeve with a possessiveness that made Henry's vision narrow to a pinpoint of fury. "Come now," Arthur said, already beginning to pull her toward the dance floor. "One dance won't hurt anything." Vivien resisted, trying to extract her arm from his grip without making an obvious scene, but Arthur's hold only tightened. Henry saw the flash of genuine fear in her eyes, the way her breath quickened, and something inside him that had been carefully contained for far too long finally broke free. He moved without conscious thought, closing the distance between them in 3 swift strides, his hand clamping down on Arthur's shoulder with enough force to make the younger man stumble. "Take your hands off that lady, sir," Henry said, his voice low and deadly calm, the kind of quiet that preceded storms. The music didn't stop, but nearby conversations faltered as heads began to turn. Arthur released Vivien's arm, spinning to face Henry with outrage coloring his features. "This is none of your concern, Whitmore. You laid hands on a woman who clearly did not wish to be touched, Henry replied, each word precisely enunciated, controlled fury evident in every syllable. That makes it everyone's concern, but particularly mine. Arthur's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. She's being dramatic. We were engaged, for God's sake. I have every right. You have no rights where Miss Caldwell is concerned, Henry interrupted, stepping between Arthur and Vivien, effectively blocking the other man from even looking at her. Your engagement was dissolved. That gives you precisely nothing except the memory of your own poor judgment. The ballroom had grown noticeably quieter now, though the orchestra gamely continued playing. Henry could feel dozens of eyes upon them, could sense the gossip already beginning to spread like wildfire through dried grass, but he found he didn't care. All that mattered was the woman standing behind him, the rapid sound of her breathing, the knowledge that Arthur had frightened her and that he, Henry, had the power to end this. Arthur's face had gone red, whether from embarrassment or anger, Henry couldn't tell and didn't particularly care to discern. "You're making a spectacle," Arthur hissed. "Over nothing, she's—" "Choose your next words very carefully," Henry warned, his voice dropping even lower, taking on the aristocratic authority that 3 generations of dukes had wielded before him. "Because whatever you say next will determine whether you leave this ballroom on your feet or on a stretcher." It wasn't an idle threat, and Arthur was intelligent enough to recognize that. Henry stood 4 inches taller and had spent years learning to box at Gentleman Jackson's, while Arthur was built for drawing rooms and card tables. More importantly, Arthur could read in Henry's eyes the absolute willingness to throw away propriety, title, and reputation if it meant protecting Vivien from further humiliation. "This isn't over," Arthur said finally, the words a weak attempt at salvaging his dignity. "Yes," Henry replied flatly. "It is." They stood there for another heartbeat, tension crackling in the air between them, before Arthur finally turned and stalked toward the exit, his departure followed by a wave of whispers that Henry knew would reach every drawing room in London by tomorrow afternoon. He didn't move until Arthur had disappeared through the ballroom doors, didn't allow himself to relax even fractionally until he was certain the threat had passed. Only then did he turn to face Vivien, and what he saw in her expression made his heart constrict painfully in his chest. She was looking at him with a mixture of gratitude, shock, and something else he didn't dare name, her grey eyes bright with unshed tears that she was valiantly refusing to let fall. "Your Grace," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly despite her obvious efforts to control it. "You didn't have to—" "Yes," he interrupted gently. "I did." She shook her head, glancing around at the assembled guests who were still watching them with undisguised curiosity. "You've made yourself the subject of scandal. For me, people will talk about this for weeks." "Let them talk," Henry said, surprised by how little the prospect bothered him. "Their opinions matter far less than they believe." "But your reputation—" "My reputation can withstand a great deal more than defending a woman from an unwanted advance," he assured her. "And even if it couldn't, I would make the same choice again without hesitation." Something shifted in her expression, a crack appearing in the careful facade she had maintained for so long. "Why?" she asked, the single word laden with a vulnerability that made him want to pull her into his arms and promise that no one would ever hurt her again. Instead, he offered her his arm, the proper gesture of a gentleman, even if his motivations were anything but proper. "Because you deserve to be protected, Miss Caldwell. Because Arthur Caldwell is a fool who threw away something precious and doesn't deserve a second chance. And because—" He paused, aware that he was approaching dangerous territory again, that honesty would only complicate an already complicated situation. "Because I couldn't stand by and watch him treat you with such disrespect." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something he wasn't sure he could give her, before finally placing her hand on his arm. Her touch, even through the layers of gloves and fabric, sent heat racing through his veins. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Truly." Henry nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and began to guide her toward the terrace doors. She needed air, needed escape from the suffocating attention of the assembled aristocracy, and he needed distance before he did something catastrophically stupid, like confessing feelings he had no business harboring. The cool night air hit them as they stepped outside. A welcome relief from the overheated ballroom. The terrace was empty, most guests preferring the warmth and entertainment inside, which gave them a privacy he knew was dangerous but couldn't bring himself to abandon. The strains of music followed them, softer now, accompanying the sound of Vivien's breathing as she released a shaky exhale. "I thought I was prepared to see him again," she said after a moment, staring out at the darkened gardens beyond the terrace. "I told myself I had moved past what happened, that it didn't matter anymore. But when he touched me, when he acted as if he had any right—" She trailed off, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warmth of the summer night. "You have nothing to prove," Henry said firmly. "Not to him, not to society, not to anyone. Arthur's behavior tonight only confirms what I've long suspected, that breaking your engagement was the best thing that could have happened to you, even if the circumstances were painful." She turned to look at him, and in the moonlight she was breathtaking in a way that had nothing to do with her physical beauty, and everything to do with the strength he could see in her bearing, the resilience that had allowed her to survive what should have destroyed her. "You've always been kind to me," she said softly. "Even when we barely knew each other, even when I was promised to someone else, you were unfailingly courteous. I never understood why. Because I was half in love with you even then," Henry thought but didn't say. "Because watching you marry Arthur would have been torture, but I would have endured it if it meant you were happy. Because every conversation with you, no matter how brief, felt like coming home." "You made it easy," he said instead, the partial truth all he could safely offer. "You've always been genuine in a world that values pretense above almost everything else. That's a rare quality, Miss Caldwell." "Vivien," she corrected, taking him by surprise. "After what happened tonight, I think we can dispense with excessive formality. You've earned that much, at least." His name on her lips would be dangerous, Henry knew. It would make this connection between them feel more real, more possible, when reality dictated that it could never be anything more than this. Stolen moments on a moonlit terrace, proximity born of crisis rather than choice, and yet he found himself nodding, accepting the gift she offered even as he recognized the peril it represented. "Henry," he said, the name feeling strange and wonderful in this context. "My friends call me Henry." She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face, and Henry felt something shift inside him, some fundamental understanding that this night had changed things in ways neither of them could yet comprehend. They had crossed a threshold, stepped past the boundaries of proper acquaintance into something undefined and potentially catastrophic, and there would be no going back to the careful distance they had maintained before. "Henry," Vivien repeated, testing the name, and he could have sworn his heart stopped beating for a moment. "I should return inside. Charlotte will wonder where I've gone, and I've caused enough scandal for one evening." She was right, of course. Propriety demanded they separate, that they return to the roles society had assigned them, that they pretend this moment of connection had never happened. And yet Henry found himself reluctant to let her go, to watch her walk back into that ballroom and resume the performance of normalcy that he knew cost her more than she let anyone see. "Would you like me to escort you home?" he offered, knowing even as he spoke that it was inappropriate but unable to stop himself. "I can have my carriage brought around. It might be more comfortable than remaining here after everything." Vivien hesitated, clearly torn between what she wanted and what was acceptable. "People would talk," she said finally, though her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "People are already talking," Henry pointed out reasonably. "At this point, the damage to both our reputations is done. We might as well choose the course that brings you the most comfort." She laughed, a surprised sound that held equal parts amusement and exasperation. "You're a terrible influence, Your Grace. Has anyone ever told you that?" "Frequently," he admitted with a slight smile, "though usually in reference to my political opinions rather than my social conduct." "Very well," Vivien decided, her chin lifting with determination. "I accept your offer. Let them talk. I'm tired of living my life according to their rules anyway." The declaration felt momentous, like witnessing a butterfly emerge from its chrysalis, and Henry felt an answering surge of something that might have been pride or possession, or the terrifying realization that he was already too far gone to save himself. He offered his arm again, and this time when she took it, her grip was firmer, more confident, as if his defense of her had somehow given her permission to reclaim a part of herself she had suppressed. They re-entered the ballroom together, and Henry felt the weight of every gaze that landed on them, felt the speculation and judgment, and barely concealed curiosity. He kept his expression neutral, aristocratic indifference perfected over years of public scrutiny, even as he remained acutely aware of Vivien beside him, her head held high despite the obvious discomfort she must be feeling. Charlotte intercepted them near the entrance, her blue eyes wide with concern and barely suppressed excitement. "Vivien, are you all right? I saw what happened with Arthur and I was about to come to you, but then, Henry—" She trailed off, looking between them with an expression that suggested she was piecing together a puzzle Henry wasn't sure he wanted solved. "I'm fine," Vivien assured her friend, squeezing Charlotte's hand. "Your brother was very gallant, but I find I'm rather tired. Henry has kindly offered to see me home." Charlotte's eyes widened further, and Henry could practically see the gears turning in her mind, connecting dots that would lead to conclusions he couldn't afford her to reach. But before she could voice whatever thoughts were forming, he intervened with the authority of an older brother who had been managing his sister's tendency toward dramatic speculation since childhood. "I'll return shortly," he said firmly. "Lord Hartley appears to be waiting for your next dance." Charlotte glanced over her shoulder, spotted Lord Hartley indeed making his way toward them, and bit her lip in obvious indecision. "But go," Vivien said gently. "I promise I'm perfectly well. We can talk tomorrow." With visible reluctance, Charlotte nodded and allowed herself to be swept back into the swirl of dancers, though she cast several backward glances that suggested this conversation was far from over. Henry made a mental note to prepare for his sister's inevitable interrogation, though what he would tell her, he had no idea. The truth was complicated, dangerous, and entirely unsuitable for sharing. The ride to Vivien's townhouse was accomplished in relative silence, both of them seemingly content to avoid discussing the evening's events until they had the privacy to process what had happened. Henry's carriage was comfortable, well-appointed, and entirely too intimate for the proximity in which they found themselves. He could hear every breath she took, could sense the residual tension in her posture, could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging between them like morning mist. When the carriage finally stopped before her home, a modest but elegant townhouse in Mayfair that she shared with her widowed aunt, Henry descended first and offered his hand to help her down. Their fingers touched, and even through the gloves he felt the connection like a spark of electricity, that same impossible pull that had drawn him to her for longer than he cared to admit. "Thank you," Vivien said as they stood on her front steps, the gas lamps casting golden light across her features. "For everything, for defending me, for seeing me home, for—" She paused, searching for words. "For treating me like I still matter." The statement cut through him like a blade, revealing the depth of damage Arthur's abandonment had inflicted. "You matter," Henry said intensely, unable to stop himself from reaching up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with a tenderness that belied every rule of proper conduct. "You have always mattered, more than you know." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly, and in that moment, Henry understood with terrible clarity that he was lost. Whatever had existed between them before tonight, whatever careful balance he had maintained, had shattered as completely as Vivien's engagement. There would be no returning to polite distance, no pretending that his feelings were merely fraternal concern or aristocratic courtesy. When she opened her eyes again, they were luminous with unshed tears and something that looked dangerously like hope. "Henry," she whispered, his name a question and a plea all at once. He should step back, should make some excuse and retreat to the safety of his carriage before he did something irreversible. Instead, he found himself leaning closer, drawn by a gravity he couldn't resist, until his forehead rested against hers and their breath mingled in the space between them. "This is madness," he said softly, even as his hand slid from her cheek to cradle the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the soft curls that had escaped her elaborate coiffure. "I know," she agreed, but she didn't pull away, didn't retreat to safety. Everything about tonight has been madness. If we continue down this path, Henry warned, needing her to understand what she was inviting, there will be no going back. Society will never forgive it. Your reputation has already been ruined once, Vivien interrupted, a note of defiance entering her voice. I survived that. I can survive this too if... She trailed off, uncertainty creeping into her expression. Unless you're regretting your actions. Unless this is simply misplaced chivalry or pity. Pity, Henry repeated, something between a laugh and a groan escaping him. God, Vivien, do you truly not see? Have you no idea what you do to me? Before she could respond, before he could second-guess the impulse, he closed the remaining distance between them and captured her lips with his own. It was neither gentle nor particularly skilled, born more of desperation than expertise, but the moment their mouths met, something ignited between them that felt like coming alive after years of merely existing. Vivien made a small sound of surprise that quickly transformed into something deeper, her hands coming up to clutch at his coat as she kissed him back with an intensity that matched his own. She tasted of champagne and hope and all the things Henry had denied himself, and he poured everything he couldn't say into that kiss, his longing, his frustration, his absolute certainty that she was worth whatever scandal might follow. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, her lips were kiss-swollen and her carefully arranged hair had come completely undone. She looked thoroughly ravished and absolutely beautiful, and Henry knew with certainty that this image would be burned into his memory forever. Well, Vivien said breathlessly, a slightly dazed smile playing at the corners of her mouth. That was catastrophically inappropriate, Henry finished, though he couldn't bring himself to feel any genuine regret. I apologize. I shouldn't have. If you apologize for that kiss, Vivien interrupted, her smile widening, I will be very cross with you. It was the first honest thing that's happened to me in months. Henry felt answering warmth bloom in his chest, dangerous and wonderful and entirely imprudent. In that case, I retract my apology, though I maintain that I shouldn't have accosted you on your own doorstep where anyone might see. Then perhaps, Vivien said slowly, her eyes holding his with an intensity that made his pulse quicken, you should come inside. My aunt has retired for the evening, and we could speak privately without risk of discovery. It was an invitation that crossed every boundary society had erected, a suggestion that could destroy them both if discovered. And yet Henry found himself nodding, found himself following her through the front door into the dimly lit foyer, found himself unable to do anything except follow where she led. The house was quiet, the servants having retired for the night, leaving them alone in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. Vivien led him to a small sitting room on the first floor, tastefully decorated in shades of cream and blue, and closed the door behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. I don't know what I'm doing, she admitted, turning to face him with remarkable candor. Arthur and I, we never even... She flushed, unable to finish the sentence. Henry crossed the room in 3 strides, taking her hands in his. We don't have to do anything except talk. I'm not Arthur, Vivien. I won't take advantage of your vulnerability or confusion. I'm not confused, she said firmly. Frightened, perhaps. Uncertain about what happens next, but not confused about this. She gestured between them. Whatever this is, it feels real in a way nothing else has for a very long time. It is real, Henry confirmed, bringing her hands to his lips and pressing a kiss to each one. Far more real than is wise or proper, or acceptable by any measure society might apply. Then we'll simply have to be improper together, Vivien decided, with a flash of the spirit he had always admired in her. Starting now. The weeks following that fateful night at Ashford Manor became a study in contradictions for both Henry and Vivien. By day, they maintained the careful pretense of propriety that society demanded, their interactions limited to chance encounters at social gatherings and carefully chaperoned visits facilitated by Charlotte's friendship. But beneath the surface of respectability, something fundamental had shifted between them, a current of connection that grew stronger with each stolen glance, each seemingly innocent conversation laden with unspoken meaning. Henry found himself accepting invitations to events he would have previously declined, his attendance motivated entirely by the possibility of seeing Vivien. He told himself he was being discreet, that no one would notice the pattern in his suddenly expanded social calendar. But Charlotte's knowing looks suggested otherwise. His sister had inherited their late mother's keen observation skills and their father's tendency toward blunt inquiry, a combination that made her both an invaluable ally and a dangerous liability. "You're playing with fire," Charlotte warned him one afternoon as they took tea in his study, rain pattering against the windows in a steady rhythm that matched his increasingly agitated thoughts. "The entire ton is already speculating about your defense of Vivien at the ball. If you continue to seek her out so obviously, people will draw conclusions." "Let them draw whatever conclusions they wish," Henry replied, setting down his teacup with more force than necessary. The delicate china rattled in protest, much like his nerves these days. "I'm tired of living my life according to the dictates of people whose opinions I neither value nor respect." Charlotte studied him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, her blue eyes, so like their mother's, seeming to peer directly into his soul. "You care for her," she said finally. And it wasn't a question. "Truly care for her, I mean. This isn't simply about defending her from Arthur or championing her against society's judgment." Henry considered denying it, considered retreating behind the aristocratic reserve that had served him well throughout his life, but found he couldn't lie to his sister. Not about this. "I've cared for her for longer than I should admit," he confessed, the words feeling both liberating and terrifying. "But nothing can come of it, Charlotte. She was engaged to Arthur. The scandal of that dissolution still clings to her reputation. If I were to court her now so soon after their broken engagement, society would eviscerate her. They would say she was the cause of the dissolution, that she had been carrying on with me all along, that she's a fortune hunter who traded up from a mere mister to a duke." "And you think she cares what society says?" Charlotte challenged, leaning forward in her chair with the same determination she had displayed as a child when refusing to accept an answer she deemed unsatisfactory. "Vivien has already survived their worst judgments. She's proven herself stronger than their cruelty. Perhaps what she needs isn't protection from scandal, but someone willing to stand beside her regardless of the consequences." The words struck something deep within Henry, a truth he had been avoiding because acknowledging it meant accepting the risk that terrified him most, not the risk to his own reputation, which he had meant what he said about not caring, but the risk of failing her, of making things worse rather than better, of his devotion becoming the instrument of her further destruction. "I won't be the cause of more pain for her," he said firmly. "She deserves better than that." "Then perhaps you should let her decide what she deserves," Charlotte suggested, rising to leave with a rustle of skirts. She paused at the door, looking back at him with an expression that blended sympathy and exasperation in equal measure. "We're hosting a dinner party next week. Vivien will be there along with Lord and Lady Pemberton, the Hartleys, and a few others. It will be intimate enough for actual conversation, but public enough to maintain appearances. Use the opportunity wisely, Henry. Or don't use it at all, but stop this torture of hovering at the edges of her life while refusing to truly enter it." After Charlotte departed, Henry sat alone in his study, staring at the rain-washed windows without really seeing them. His sister's words echoed in his mind, challenging assumptions he had made about protection and propriety, about what Vivien truly needed versus what he had decided she should have. The truth, uncomfortable as it was to acknowledge, was that he had been acting out of his own fear rather than her best interests. He had convinced himself that distance was noble, that restraint demonstrated respect, but perhaps it was simply cowardice dressed in gentleman's clothing. Perhaps Charlotte was right, and what Vivien truly deserved was honesty, agency, the ability to make her own choices about her life, rather than having men, whether Arthur or himself, decide for her what was best. Meanwhile, in her townhouse across Mayfair, Vivien sat in her private sitting room, with a book she had been pretending to read for the better part of an hour. The words blurred together on the page, meaningless symbols that couldn't compete with the memories that had taken up permanent residence in her thoughts. She could still feel the pressure of Henry's lips against hers, could still recall the way his hands had cradled her face with such tenderness, could still hear the rough timbre of his voice when he had said she mattered. No one had made her feel like she mattered in a very long time. Certainly not Arthur, who had treated their engagement as a business arrangement that could be dissolved when a better opportunity presented itself. Not society, which had judged her harshly for the crime of being abandoned, while simultaneously pitying her as if she were a broken thing in need of repair. Not even her well-meaning aunt, who loved her but viewed her as a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of trusting one's heart to the wrong man. But Henry had looked at her as if she was something precious, something worth defending, something deserving of passion rather than pity. And then, in the weeks since that night, he had seemed to retreat behind walls of propriety that felt almost as confining as Arthur's absence had been. She saw him at social gatherings, of course. London's aristocratic circles were too small to avoid anyone for long, but their interactions had become stilted, overly formal, stripped of the honesty that had characterized their conversation on the terrace. He would bow, she would curtsy. They would exchange pleasantries about the weather or some inconsequential bit of gossip, and then he would make some excuse to move along to another conversation. It was agony masquerading as manners, and Vivien found herself growing increasingly frustrated with the game they were forced to play. "You're brooding again," her Aunt Beatrice observed from her chair by the window, setting aside her embroidery with a knowing look. "You've been staring at that same page for 20 minutes. Either the book is exceptionally boring or your mind is elsewhere." Vivien closed the book with a sigh, abandoning all pretense of reading. "I'm simply tired of London," she lied, or perhaps half-lied, since she was indeed tired of many aspects of her life in the city. "Perhaps we should consider spending the rest of the season at the cottage in Bath." Beatrice raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. "You've never expressed any desire to leave London mid-season before. This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain duke, would it?" Heat flooded Vivien's cheeks, betraying her before she could even attempt a denial. "I don't know what you mean." "My dear child," Beatrice said with the indulgent tone of someone who had seen far too much of life to be deceived by transparent evasions, "I may be old, but I'm neither blind nor stupid. The way you and the Duke of Whitmore look at each other could set draperies ablaze. Half of London has noticed, which means all of London will be discussing it by next week." Vivien's stomach sank. She had thought they were being careful, that their stolen glances and carefully neutral conversations were maintaining the fiction of mere acquaintance. But if her aunt, who rarely attended social events and spent most of her time at home with her needlework and novels, had noticed something, then they had been far less subtle than she believed. "There's nothing to discuss," Vivien said firmly, trying to convince herself as much as her aunt. "The Duke was kind to me at a moment when I needed kindness. That's all." "If you say so," Beatrice replied, her tone suggesting she believed nothing of the sort. "Though I would point out that kindness and the look I saw in his eyes when he defended you from that dreadful Coldwell boy are two entirely different things. The Duke, my dear, is a man besotted. The question is what you intend to do about it." Before Vivien could formulate a response or decide whether she even wanted to try, a knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Moments later, their butler appeared with a silver salver, bearing a cream-colored envelope addressed in Charlotte's distinctive handwriting. Vivien opened it with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from anticipation or anxiety she couldn't have said. Inside was an invitation to an intimate dinner party at the Whitmore townhouse the following week, the guest list small enough to be intriguing and large enough to be respectable. "Charlotte has invited me to dinner," she said, passing the invitation to her aunt for inspection. Beatrice examined it with the practiced eye of someone who had navigated society's complexities for 5 decades. "A dinner party at the Duke's residence with you as a guest," she mused. "That's rather pointed, isn't it? Lady Charlotte is making a statement about your respectability, your place in her inner circle. It's a vote of confidence that will not go unnoticed." Vivien hadn't considered that angle, had been too focused on the prospect of spending an evening in Henry's home, of seeing him in his own element rather than the neutral territory of someone else's ballroom. But her aunt was right. Charlotte's invitation was strategic, a public declaration of support that would force society to reconsider its judgment of Vivien or risk insulting one of the most powerful families in England. "I should decline," Vivien said, even as every fibre of her being rebelled against the idea. "It will only fuel speculation." "Nonsense," Beatrice declared, returning the invitation with a decisive nod. "You'll accept, and you'll wear that emerald gown that makes your eyes look like storm clouds. If society is going to talk regardless of what you do, you might as well give them something worth discussing." The week preceding the dinner party passed with agonizing slowness for Henry. He threw himself into his duties in Parliament, debating agricultural reform with a passion that surprised his colleagues, anything to distract himself from the knowledge that Vivien would soon be under his roof, sitting at his table, close enough to touch if he dared to abandon all pretense of propriety. Charlotte had planned the seating arrangements with her characteristic attention to detail and her less characteristic sense of mischief. Vivien would be seated to Henry's right at dinner, the position of honor traditionally reserved for the most important female guest. It was a statement, a declaration that Vivien Caldwell deserved respect, regardless of her broken engagement, and Henry both blessed and cursed his sister for her audacity. The evening of the dinner party arrived with unseasonable warmth, summer asserting itself despite the calendar's insistence that autumn was approaching. Henry found himself changing his cravat 3 times, much to his valet's barely concealed amusement, before finally settling on a simple but elegant arrangement that wouldn't draw undue attention, but wouldn't disgrace him either. "You look very fine, Your Grace," his valet observed, with the familiarity of someone who had served the family for 30 years. "The lady will be impressed." Henry shot him a sharp look. "I'm not dressing to impress anyone, Martin. It's simply a dinner party." "Of course, Your Grace," Martin agreed, his tone suggesting he believed nothing of the sort. "Will that be all?" Dismissed, Henry made his way downstairs to find Charlotte already receiving their first guests in the drawing room. She looked radiant in a gown of pale blue silk, her blonde hair arranged in an elaborate style that probably took her maid 2 hours to perfect. When she saw him, her smile widened in a way that made him instantly suspicious. "You look nervous," she observed once the first guests had been greeted and were engaged in conversation among themselves. "Should I be concerned that you'll say something inappropriate over the soup course?" "I'm perfectly composed," Henry lied, "though I question the wisdom of your seating arrangements. People will read far too much into Vivien's placement at my right hand." "Good," Charlotte replied without a hint of remorse. "Let them read into it. Let them see that the Duke of Whitmore considers Miss Caldwell worthy of the highest honor. Let them choke on their judgment and their gossip while they're at it." Before Henry could respond to this declaration of social warfare, the butler announced new arrivals, and suddenly Vivien was there, standing in the doorway like something from a dream. She wore emerald silk that brought out the grey-green of her eyes, her dark hair arranged to show the elegant column of her neck, and Henry felt his carefully maintained composure crumble like sandcastles before the tide. Their eyes met across the room, and the noise of conversation seemed to fade into insignificance. He could see the flutter of her pulse at the base of her throat, could read the mixture of apprehension and something warmer in her expression, could feel the pull of connection that had only grown stronger with their enforced distance. Charlotte nudged him none too gently in the ribs. "Go greet your guest, brother." "So are you planning to simply stare at her all evening like a besotted schoolboy?" Henry moved forward, willing his expression into something resembling aristocratic neutrality, even as every instinct screamed at him to cross the room in 3 strides and pull her into his arms. "Miss Caldwell," he said, bowing over her hand with perfect correctness. "Welcome to my home." "Your Grace," she replied, and was it his imagination, or did her voice carry the faintest tremor? "Thank you for having me. Your home is beautiful. It pales in comparison to its current company," Henry said before he could stop himself, the words emerging with an honesty that made Charlotte cough delicately beside him. Vivien's cheeks flushed to becoming pink, and a smile played at the corners of her mouth. "You're very kind." "I'm very honest," he corrected, earning himself another sharp look from his sister. The rest of the guests arrived in short order. Lord and Lady Pemberton, the Earl and Countess of Hartley, Sir William and Lady Margaret Crawford, and a few others who made up Charlotte's intimate circle. They were all people Henry knew and generally trusted, which he supposed was his sister's point. This wasn't a performance for hostile observers, but rather a gathering among friends, a safe space where perhaps he and Vivien could simply be themselves without the weight of society's constant scrutiny. Dinner was announced, and Henry offered his arm to Vivien with all the ceremony due to the guest of honor. She placed her hand on his sleeve, and even through the layers of clothing, he felt the contact like a brand. They processed into the dining room, a space Henry had always found rather cold and formal, with its long mahogany table and heavy burgundy drapes, but somehow Vivien's presence transformed it into something warmer, more intimate. The meal progressed through its various courses with the kind of lively conversation that marked Charlotte's best gatherings. She had a gift for bringing together interesting people and facilitating discussions that ranged from politics to literature to the latest scientific discoveries, all while ensuring no one dominated the conversation or was left feeling excluded. Henry found himself engaged in a debate with Lord Pemberton about the proposed railway expansion, while simultaneously aware of every breath Vivien took beside him, every small movement, every word she contributed to her conversation with Lady Hartley about the children's hospital where she volunteered. "You're distracted," Pemberton observed with amusement during a lull in their discussion. "I haven't seen you this unfocused since that debate over Corn Law reform 3 years ago, and you had pneumonia at the time." Henry had the grace to look abashed. "My apologies. I've had much on my mind lately." "Or someone on your mind," Pemberton corrected, his gaze flicking meaningfully toward Vivien before returning to Henry with a knowing smile. "She's lovely, and from what I've observed, considerably more intelligent than most of the simpering debutantes who usually occupy society's attention. If you're interested, Whitmore, don't let propriety or fear of scandal stop you. Life is too short to waste on what other people think." The words, coming from a man who had himself defied society by marrying a widow of questionable reputation and had spent the last 15 years blissfully happy despite the initial condemnation, carried particular weight. Henry nodded slowly, filing the advice away to examine later when his thoughts were less chaotic. As the main course was cleared and dessert served, a spectacular array of French pastries that drew appreciative murmurs from the guests, Charlotte rose to propose a toast. "To friendship," she said, raising her glass, "and to those brave enough to live authentically, despite the expectations placed upon them." It was pointed, perhaps too pointed, but the guests raised their glasses gamely enough. Henry caught Vivien's eye as they drank, and in that moment something passed between them, an understanding that Charlotte's words had been meant for them specifically, a blessing and a challenge combined. After dinner, the party retired to the music room, where Charlotte prevailed upon Lady Crawford to play the pianoforte, while the other guests arranged themselves in comfortable groupings for conversation. Henry found himself drawn to the window seat, where Vivien had settled, slightly removed from the main gathering but not so distant as to appear antisocial. "May I join you?" he asked, even though every rule of propriety suggested he should circulate among all his guests rather than monopolizing one. "I wish you would," Vivien replied, and the warmth in her voice made his decision easy. He sat beside her, closer than was strictly proper, their bodies not quite touching but near enough that he could feel her heat, could catch the subtle scent of lavender that always seemed to cling to her. From this vantage point, they could observe the other guests without being the center of attention, a small island of privacy in a room full of people. "Your sister has been very kind to me," Vivien said softly, watching Charlotte laugh at something Lord Hartley had said. "This dinner, the seating arrangements, all of it. She's making a statement." "Charlotte has never been subtle," Henry agreed, "though in this case, I'm grateful for her lack of discretion. You deserve to be honored, Vivien. You deserve to be treated with respect by people who matter." She turned to look at him directly, and he saw questions in her eyes, uncertainties that his careful distance had created. "And do you respect me, Henry? Is that what this is, respect?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning, demanding honesty he wasn't sure he could give in a room full of witnesses. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps Charlotte had orchestrated this entire evening, not to provide them with privacy, but to force them into honesty, to make them acknowledge in front of people who mattered what they had been denying in private. "I respect you immensely," Henry said carefully, aware that several people had stopped their conversations and were watching them with undisguised interest. But if I'm being completely honest, respect is perhaps the least complicated of the feelings you inspire in me. Vivien's breath caught, and he saw hope bloom in her expression like flowers after rain. And the more complicated feelings? This was it, the moment where he could retreat behind propriety or step forward into honesty. Charlotte caught his eye from across the room, giving him the smallest nod of encouragement. Lord Pemberton was smiling knowingly. Even Lady Hartley, usually a stickler for propriety, looked approving rather than scandalized. "I find myself thinking about you constantly," Henry admitted, his voice low enough that only she could hear, though he suspected others were straining to catch his words. "I attend events I have no interest in simply for the possibility of seeing you. I lie awake at night replaying our conversations, wondering what you're thinking, whether you remember that night on your doorstep with the same mix of wonder and terror that I do." "Terror?" Vivien echoed, something like hurt flickering across her features. "Terror that I'll fail you," Henry clarified quickly, "that my feelings will become another burden you have to carry, another scandal you have to survive, that I'll hurt you the way Arthur did, even though the thought of causing you pain is unbearable." Vivien reached out and took his hand, right there in front of everyone, a gesture of shocking intimacy that made several guests gasp audibly. "You're not Arthur," she said firmly, "and I'm not some fragile thing that will shatter under scrutiny. I've already survived the worst society can throw at me. The question isn't whether I can withstand scandal, but whether you're willing to risk it, whether what you feel is strong enough to justify the consequences." Henry looked down at their joined hands, at the way her fingers threaded through his with perfect naturalness, and felt something settle in his chest, a certainty that had been building since the moment he'd defended her from Arthur's unwanted advances. "It's strong enough," he said, and even though his voice was quiet, it carried through the room with absolute conviction. "I care for you, Vivien. I have cared for you for longer than I should probably admit. And I'm done pretending that propriety matters more than honesty, that society's judgment is more important than the possibility of happiness." The music had stopped, Lady Crawford's hands frozen above the keys. Every conversation had ceased, every eye in the room fixed on them with varying degrees of surprise, approval, and in a few cases, delighted satisfaction. Charlotte looked particularly triumphant, as if she had orchestrated this exact outcome through careful manipulation of circumstances. "Well," Charlotte said into the ringing silence, her voice bright with barely suppressed glee, "I believe we've just witnessed a declaration. Someone should probably say something profound or at least toast to it." Lord Pemberton raised his glass immediately. "To honesty," he declared, "and to those brave enough to pursue happiness despite the obstacles in their path." The other guests echoed the sentiment, raising their glasses in a show of support that made Henry's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. He had expected judgment, condemnation, at least a few disapproving looks. Instead, he found acceptance, encouragement, the goodwill of friends who apparently valued genuine feeling over artificial propriety. Vivien squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears that seemed to be equal parts joy and relief. "You mean it?" she asked softly. "You're truly willing to face whatever comes?" "With you beside me," Henry confirmed, "I'm willing to face anything." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and well wishes, of Charlotte looking insufferably smug, of their guests departing with promises to support them against any who might criticize their courtship. By the time the last carriage had departed, and only Charlotte, Vivien, and Henry remained in the now quiet drawing room, Henry felt simultaneously exhausted and more alive than he had in years. "I should go," Vivien said reluctantly, though she made no move to actually leave. "My aunt will worry." "I'll escort you home," Henry offered immediately. "It's late and I won't have you traveling alone." Charlotte yawned dramatically, though her eyes sparkled with mischief. "I'm completely exhausted from playing hostess. I believe I'll retire immediately and won't notice at all if my brother's return is somewhat delayed. Good night, Vivien. Henry." She swept from the room before either of them could respond, leaving them alone in a way that was technically improper but felt inevitable. Henry stood and offered his hand to help Vivien rise, and when she placed her palm against his, He couldn't resist bringing it to his lips for a kiss that lingered longer than strictly appropriate. "Your sister is incorrigible," Vivien observed, but she was smiling. "My sister is brilliant," Henry corrected, "though I'll deny saying so if you ever tell her." The carriage ride to Vivien's townhouse was different from that first night after the ball. Then, they had been tentative, uncertain, afraid to name what existed between them. Now, with his public declaration still ringing in the air, they sat close together on the bench seat, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest in a position that felt both natural and absolutely right. "What happens now?" Vivien asked, as the carriage rumbled through London's gas-lit streets. "You've declared yourself publicly, which means there's no taking it back. Tomorrow all of London will know that the Duke of Whitmore is courting the woman whose engagement was so recently dissolved." "Let them know," Henry said firmly. "Let them gossip and speculate and judge. I'm done living my life according to their rules." "But your position in Parliament, your reputation, will survive," Henry interrupted. "And even if they don't, even if this costs me politically or socially, I can't bring myself to care. I've spent my entire life doing what was expected, being who everyone needed me to be. For once I want to be selfish. I want to pursue what makes me happy, and what makes me happy, Vivien, is you." She tilted her head back to look at him, and in the flickering light from the street lamps passing outside, she was breathtaking. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," she admitted. "After Arthur, I convinced myself that I was better off alone, that trusting anyone with my heart was too dangerous. And then you defended me at that ball, and something inside me that I thought had died started to wake up again." "I'm glad," Henry said, cupping her face in his hands. "Because I intend to spend however long you'll let me proving that you were right to trust again, that not all men are Arthur Coldwell, that some of us recognize precious things when we find them and fight to keep them." "However long I'll let you," Vivien echoed, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Henry, I think you're rather stuck with me now. After tonight's very public declaration, you can't possibly back out without looking like a complete cad." "Then it's fortunate," Henry murmured, leaning closer, "that I have no intention of backing out." He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring rather than claiming. She melted against him with a soft sound of contentment, her arms winding around his neck, and Henry thought that he could happily spend the rest of his life exactly like this, with Vivien in his arms and the future spreading before them like an unwritten story waiting to be told. The carriage stopped too soon, delivering them to her townhouse far sooner than either would have preferred. Henry helped her down, and they stood on her front steps much as they had weeks ago, though everything had changed between then and now. "Come calling tomorrow," Vivien said, not a question but a command. "In the afternoon, with flowers. Let's do this properly, with all the courtship rituals society demands." "Even though we've rather done things backwards?" Henry asked with amusement. "Especially because we've done things backwards," Vivien replied. "I want those rituals, Henry. I want the flowers and the calls and the carefully chaperoned walks in the park. I want everything Arthur never gave me because he viewed our engagement as a business arrangement rather than a romance." "Then you shall have it all," Henry promised. "Though I warn you, I'm quite terrible at poetry. Charlotte will mock me mercilessly." "I don't need poetry," Vivien assured him. "I just need honesty. And you." He kissed her once more, properly this time, aware that they were standing in full view of any passing carriages or curious neighbours. Let them see, he thought. Let them witness the beginning of something that refused to hide in shadows or apologize for existing. When he finally climbed back into his carriage for the short ride home, Henry felt lighter than he had in years, as if acknowledging his feelings had somehow freed him from a weight he hadn't fully recognized he'd been carrying. The future was uncertain, scandal was probable, and society's judgment was guaranteed. But none of that mattered because for the first time in his carefully orchestrated life, he was choosing passion over propriety, happiness over duty, love over fear. And if that made him a fool by society's standards, then he would be the happiest fool in London. The scandal, when it broke, was even more spectacular than Henry had anticipated. By the morning following Charlotte's dinner party, Every drawing room in Mayfair buzzed with news of the Duke of Whitmore's shocking declaration. The gossip columns seized upon the story with ravenous delight, painting it as everything from a great romance to a calculated social climbing scheme, depending on which publication one read and how charitable they felt toward either party. Henry discovered the extent of the furor when his secretary arrived at breakfast with an armful of newspapers and invitations, his expression hovering somewhere between concern and barely suppressed panic. "Your Grace," Mr. Pemberton said, no relation to Lord Pemberton, though the coincidence had provided amusement over the years. "I'm afraid the Morning Post has been rather overwhelming." Henry set down his coffee and accepted the stack of correspondence with resignation. The top invitation was from Lady Ashford, requesting his presence at her next soirée with a postscript that heavily implied his attendance without Miss Caldwell would be considered a grave insult. The second was from the Dowager Duchess of Somerset, one of society's most formidable arbiters of taste, expressing her approval of his choice and offering Vivien her patronage. The third was from Lord Ashworth, suggesting they discuss Henry's continued involvement in the Agricultural Reform Committee, given his recent preoccupations with personal matters. "Ah," Henry said mildly, setting the letters aside. "So it begins. There's also this," his secretary added reluctantly, producing a newspaper folded to display a particularly vicious gossip column. Henry scanned the text, his jaw tightening as he read the barely veiled accusations that Vivien had been carrying on with him during her engagement to Arthur, that the broken engagement had been her fault, that she had manipulated circumstances to trade a mere gentleman for a duke. The lies were creative, he'd give them that, but they were still lies, and reading them made his blood boil with protective fury. Vivien would see these same papers, would read these same accusations, and the thought of her facing this venom alone was intolerable. "Have my horse saddled," Henry commanded, rising from the table. "I'm going out." "Your Grace, you have meetings this morning." "Cancel them," Henry interrupted, already heading for the door. "Or reschedule them. I don't particularly care which. Right now there's somewhere far more important I need to be." 20 minutes later, he was knocking on Vivien's door with enough force to suggest urgency without quite crossing into alarm. The butler who answered looked relieved to see him, which Henry took as a bad sign. He was shown immediately to the morning room, where he found Vivien seated by the window with what appeared to be every scandal sheet in London spread across the table before her. She looked up at his entrance, and Henry's heart clenched at the sight of her. She was still in her dressing gown, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that was both improper and absolutely enchanting, and her eyes were red-rimmed as if she'd been crying, though her expression was more angry than devastated. "Have you seen these?" she demanded, gesturing at the newspapers with a hand that trembled slightly. "They're calling me a social climber, a manipulator, a woman of questionable morals who broke her own engagement to pursue a duke. One of them actually suggested I should be barred from polite society for my calculated assault on propriety." Henry crossed the room and pulled her into his arms without hesitation. Scandal and propriety be damned. She resisted for perhaps half a second before melting against him, her fingers clutching at his coat, as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly tilted sideways. "They're lies," he said firmly, one hand stroking her hair in what he hoped was a comforting gesture. "Vicious, cowardly lies written by people who wouldn't recognize genuine feeling if it struck them in the face. And anyone with half a brain will see through them." "But what if they don't?" Vivien asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "What if this destroys you? What if your work in Parliament suffers because you're associated with me? What if—" "Then I'll survive it," Henry interrupted. "We'll survive it together. Vivien, look at me." She pulled back far enough to meet his eyes, and he cupped her face in his hands with infinite gentleness. "I told you last night that I was done living according to their rules. I meant it. These people, these gossips and scandal-mongers, they have no power over us unless we give it to them. So we won't give it. We'll hold our heads high, we'll continue exactly as we planned, and we'll show them that love, real, honest love, is stronger than their judgment." "Love?" Vivien echoed, her eyes widening. "Henry, we haven't— You've never—" "I love you," he said, the words coming easily now that he'd finally allowed himself to speak them. I think I've loved you for years, if I'm being completely honest. Watching you with Arthur was torture. Seeing you hurt when he abandoned you made me want to call him out. Consequences be damned. And holding you, kissing you, being near you, feels more right than anything else in my entire carefully orchestrated life. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but these were different from the ones she'd shed over the scandal sheets. These were tears of joy, of relief, of emotions too large to be contained. I love you too, she whispered. I didn't want to, didn't mean to. I told myself it was too soon, too complicated, that I should wait a respectable amount of time. But the heart doesn't care about respectability, does it? If it did, Henry replied, kissing away her tears, it wouldn't be worth very much. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms while London's gossip sharpened their knives outside. Eventually, Vivien's Aunt Beatrice cleared her throat from the doorway, making them spring apart with guilty haste. I do hope you intend to marry her, Beatrice observed dryly, though her eyes were twinkling. Because having the Duke of Whitmore in my niece's morning room, while she's still in her dressing gown, is precisely the sort of scandal that could finish what those dreadful newspapers started. I intend to marry her as soon as she'll have me, Henry replied without hesitation, then turned to Vivien with sudden urgency. That is, if you'll have me. I realize this is rather backwards, that I should have courted you properly first, should have spoken to your father. My father is dead, Vivien interrupted gently, and my aunt is right here, looking extremely expectant. Beatrice nodded encouragingly. I am indeed, and I would very much like to know whether I should begin planning a wedding or start composing strongly worded letters to editors defending my niece's virtue. Henry dropped to one knee right there in the morning room, still holding Vivien's hand, feeling simultaneously terrified and absolutely certain. Vivien Caldwell, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? I can't promise that society will make it easy. I can't even promise that the scandal will die down quickly, but I can promise that I will love you fiercely and defend you constantly and spend every day trying to deserve the gift of your presence in my life. Vivien's smile was radiant enough to light the entire room. Yes, she said simply. Yes, Henry, I'll marry you. I'll face the scandal and the gossip and whatever else comes, because being with you is worth all of it and more. He rose and kissed her properly, thoroughly, with an enthusiasm that made Beatrice cough pointedly and mutter something about propriety before tactfully withdrawing to give them a moment of privacy. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vivien was laughing with pure joy. We're going to be the talk of London for months, she predicted. Years, probably, Henry agreed cheerfully. But perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing. Let them see that love exists outside their rigid rules. Let them witness what happens when two people choose each other despite the obstacles. Perhaps it will give others courage to do the same. The engagement was announced in the Times the following morning, accompanied by a notice that the wedding would take place in 6 weeks at the Duke's private chapel in Devonshire, followed by a breakfast at Whitmore Hall. It was fast by society's standards, but Henry was done waiting, done pretending that propriety mattered more than happiness, and Vivien agreed enthusiastically. The reactions were predictably mixed. Some of society's most prominent families sent congratulations and offered their support. Others snubbed them at gatherings, turned their backs in shops, made it clear through pointed exclusion that they considered the match scandalous at best and mercenary at worst. Arthur Caldwell predictably had opinions, which he shared liberally with anyone who would listen, painting himself as the wronged party who had been betrayed by both his former fiancé and a man he'd considered a friend. Henry endured this with gritted teeth until the afternoon he encountered Arthur at his club, a meeting that had clearly been orchestrated by Arthur himself. The younger man approached with false bonhomie, drink in hand, surrounded by a cluster of gentlemen who seemed eager for entertainment. Whitmore, Arthur said loudly enough to draw attention from surrounding groups. Congratulations on your engagement. I do hope Vivien proves more faithful to you than she was to me. The implication was clear, the insult obvious, and Henry felt rage sweep through him like wildfire. But he forced himself to remain calm, to respond with the cutting precision that aristocratic breeding and years of parliamentary debate had taught him. "I'm surprised you're concerned about faithfulness, Coldwell," Henry replied coolly, his voice carrying through the sudden silence that had fallen over the room. "Given that you demonstrated none when you broke your engagement without explanation, leaving Miss Caldwell to face society's judgment alone. But then, you never did understand the concept of honor, did you?" Arthur's face reddened. "How dare you? How dare I?" Henry interrupted, taking a step closer, using his superior height to intimidating effect. "How dare I defend a woman you treated abominably? How dare I call out a coward who attacks from safety rather than facing the consequences of his own poor choices? You want to know what really happened, Coldwell? You want the truth that everyone here is too polite to say to your face?" The room had gone completely silent now, every man present watching with rapt attention. Henry knew he was crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed, but he was beyond caring. Arthur had pushed too far, had insulted Vivien once too often, and it was time someone spoke the truth publicly. "You broke your engagement because you received a better offer," Henry continued, his voice hard and cold. "The daughter of that merchant you were courting, the one with the substantial dowry that would have cleared your father's debts. You threw aside a woman of character and grace for money, which tells everyone here exactly what kind of man you are. So don't you dare stand there and imply that Vivien was anything less than completely honorable. She deserves better than you could ever be, which is why she's marrying me instead." Arthur looked as if he might actually throw a punch, his fists clenched at his sides, his face purple with rage. But he was also aware of the audience, aware that violence would only confirm everything Henry had just said, and after a long, tense moment, he turned and stalked from the room without another word. The silence that followed was broken by Lord Pemberton, who had been sitting nearby and witnessed the entire exchange. "Well said, Whitmore," he declared, raising his glass. "It's about time someone called that pompous ass out for his behavior." Several other men echoed the sentiment, and Henry felt some of the tension drain from his shoulders. He had made an enemy today, but he had also made a point, and perhaps more importantly, he had defended Vivien's honor in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. By tomorrow, every drawing room in London would know the truth about Arthur's broken engagement, and maybe, just maybe, society would finally stop blaming Vivien for circumstances beyond her control. When he arrived at Vivien's townhouse that evening for dinner, a properly chaperoned affair with Beatrice in attendance, he found her waiting in the drawing room with an expression that suggested she had already heard about the confrontation. "You challenged Arthur at your club," she said without preamble, "in front of half the aristocracy." "I defended you at my club," Henry corrected. "There's a difference." Vivien crossed to him and took his hands in hers, her expression serious. "Henry, you can't keep fighting my battles for me. I'm strong enough to weather their gossip, to endure their judgment." "I know you are," he interrupted gently. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. But that doesn't mean you should have to face everything alone. That's what partners do, Vivien. We fight for each other, defend each other, stand together against whatever comes. And if that means occasionally putting pompous asses like Arthur Coldwell in their place, then so be it." A smile tugged at her lips despite her obvious attempt to remain stern. "You're incorrigible." "I'm in love," Henry corrected, "and I'm done pretending that means anything less than complete devotion and unwavering support." The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and surprising support. Charlotte threw herself into planning with enthusiasm that bordered on manic, determined to create an event so spectacular that society would have no choice but to acknowledge its magnificence. The Dowager Duchess of Somerset made good on her promise of patronage, hosting a tea in Vivien's honor that was attended by some of the most influential women in London. Lord Pemberton and several other members of Parliament publicly endorsed the match, making it clear that Henry's political standing was undiminished despite the scandal. But perhaps most importantly, Vivien bloomed like a flower, finally given proper sunlight. The sadness that had clung to her since Arthur's betrayal gradually lifted, replaced by a joy that made her luminous. She laughed more freely, spoke more boldly, carried herself with a confidence that came from being genuinely valued rather than merely tolerated. Henry found himself falling more deeply in love with each passing day, discovering new facets of her personality that delighted and surprised him. She was wickedly funny when she relaxed her guard, could debate philosophy and politics with impressive knowledge, and had strong opinions about everything from agricultural reform to the proper way to arrange roses. She was also passionate in ways that made him grateful for Beatrice's vigilant chaperoning, because the temptation to abandon propriety entirely grew stronger every time they were alone. The wedding day arrived with perfect weather, as if nature itself was blessing their union. The private chapel at Whitmore Hall was small, intimate, decorated with thousands of white roses that filled the air with their scent. The guest list included only those people who truly mattered: Charlotte and her growing attachment to Lord Hartley, whom Henry suspected would be next to make a romantic declaration; Lord and Lady Pemberton, the Dowager Duchess, Beatrice, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and a handful of other friends who had supported them through the scandal. Henry stood at the altar, watching Vivien process down the aisle on Beatrice's arm, and he had to blink back tears at the sight of her. She wore ivory silk that shimmered in the candlelight, her dark hair crowned with orange blossoms, and her smile was radiant with happiness so pure it almost hurt to witness. This woman, this remarkable, resilient, absolutely extraordinary woman, had chosen him, had agreed to bind her life to his despite the obstacles, despite the scandal, despite every reason society had given her to refuse. The ceremony itself passed in a haze of emotion. He heard himself make his vows, heard Vivien's clear voice responding with her own, felt the cool metal of the ring as he slid it onto her finger. And then the priest was declaring them husband and wife, and Henry was kissing her with more enthusiasm than was probably appropriate in church, but couldn't bring himself to care because she was his, finally and irrevocably his. The breakfast that followed was everything Charlotte had promised: spectacular food, flowing champagne, toasts that ranged from sentimental to hilarious. Lord Pemberton stood and recounted the story of their courtship with embellishments that made both Henry and Vivien laugh. The Dowager Duchess proclaimed them her favourite couple of the season and predicted their marriage would be one of legendary happiness. Charlotte, slightly tearful and definitely tipsy, announced that she had known from the beginning they were perfect for each other and demanded credit for orchestrating their declaration at her dinner party. But eventually the breakfast ended, the guests departed, and Henry and Vivien were finally blessedly alone in the carriage that would take them to Whitmore Hall for their wedding night. The moment the door closed behind them, he pulled her into his lap with more urgency than grace, and she came willingly, laughing against his mouth as he kissed her with all the pent-up passion of their carefully chaperoned courtship. "We're married," she said wonderingly when they broke apart for air. "Actually married. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real." "It's real," Henry assured her, trailing kisses down her neck in a way that made her shiver. "You're my wife, my Duchess, mine." "Yours," she agreed, threading her fingers through his hair. "As you are mine, Your Grace." "Just Henry," he corrected. "Always just Henry when we're alone." Whitmore Hall had been prepared for their arrival with a level of romantic attention that Henry suspected was entirely Charlotte's doing. Their private suite was filled with candles and roses, champagne chilling in a silver bucket, the bed turned down invitingly. It was beautiful and intimate, and almost overwhelming in its implications of what came next. Vivien seemed to sense his sudden nervousness because she took his hand and squeezed gently. "We don't have to rush anything," she said softly. "We have the rest of our lives." "I want to rush everything," Henry admitted with raw honesty. "I've waited so long to have you like this, to be able to touch you without restraint, to show you with more than words how much you mean to me. But I'm also terrified of disappointing you, of not being what you need." She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her grey-green eyes serious and full of love. "You could never disappoint me, Henry. You've already given me more than I ever thought I'd have. Respect, passion, partnership, a love that doesn't ask me to diminish myself to fit someone else's expectations. Whatever happens tonight, however clumsy or awkward we might be, we'll figure it out together." And they did figure it out together with laughter and tenderness, and gradually increasing confidence as the night wore on. Henry discovered that Vivien was passionate and surprisingly bold once her nervousness faded, that she met him touch for touch, kiss for kiss, with an enthusiasm that made him feel like the most fortunate man alive. And when they finally lay tangled together in the aftermath, her head on his chest and his arms wrapped around her. Henry thought that perhaps this was what happiness truly meant, not the absence of difficulty or scandal or challenge, but the presence of someone who made facing all of it worthwhile. The weeks and months that followed established new rhythms in their life together. They divided their time between London and Whitmore Hall, Henry attending to his parliamentary duties, while Vivien threw herself into charitable work with renewed energy. Together, they became known as a formidable political partnership, with Vivien's insights on social reform complementing Henry's work on agricultural policy. The scandal that had accompanied their courtship gradually faded, replaced by respect for their obvious devotion and the good they accomplished together. Arthur Coldwell eventually married his merchant's daughter in a wedding that was lavish but oddly joyless, according to those who attended. He and Henry never spoke again, their enmity settling into cold distance rather than hot conflict. Vivien occasionally saw his wife at social gatherings and reported that the young woman looked progressively more unhappy, which made Vivien grateful all over again for the bullet she had dodged. Charlotte did eventually marry Lord Hartley, in a wedding that rivaled Henry and Vivien's in romance if not quite in scandal. She claimed credit for Henry's happiness at every possible opportunity and extracted promises that they would name their first daughter after her, which both Henry and Vivien agreed to with amusement and genuine affection. On their first anniversary, Henry woke to find Vivien already awake beside him, propped on one elbow and watching him with an expression of such contentment that it made his chest tight with emotion. "Good morning, husband," she said softly, trailing her fingers along his jaw. "Good morning, wife," he replied, catching her hand and kissing her palm. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" "About how different my life is from what I imagined a year ago," she admitted. "When Arthur broke our engagement, I thought my chance at happiness was over. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life as a cautionary tale, a woman to be pitied rather than envied. And then you defended me at that ball, and everything changed." "Everything changed for me too," Henry said, pulling her closer until she was nestled against his chest. "I had convinced myself that duty was enough, that I could be content with a life of careful propriety and emotional distance. And then you happened, and suddenly nothing was enough except you. Do you regret it?" Vivien asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "The scandal, the gossip, the way people still whisper about us sometimes." "Not for a single moment," Henry replied without hesitation. "I would endure 1,000 scandals for one day of being loved by you. Though I admit," he added with a grin, "it's rather nice that most of the gossip has died down." "Most of it will probably resurge when I tell you my news," Vivien said, a mysterious smile playing at her lips. Henry felt his heart skip a beat at her expression, at the barely contained excitement in her eyes. "News?" "I'm with child," she announced, and the joy in her voice made everything else insignificant. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Henry." He stared at her for a long moment, words failing him entirely as the magnitude of her announcement settled over him. A baby. Their baby. A child created from love rather than duty, from passion rather than convenience. He was going to be a father, and Vivien was going to be a mother, and somehow their scandalous love story was producing new life and new hope and new possibilities. "Say something," Vivien urged, anxiety creeping into her expression when his silence stretched too long. "Please tell me you're happy about this." "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Henry managed finally, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled her into a kiss that tried to communicate everything he couldn't put into words, his joy, his gratitude, his absolute wonder that this woman had chosen him, had married him, had given him a love he hadn't known he was missing until he found it. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying simultaneously, Henry pressed his hand to her still flat stomach with reverence. "Thank you," he said softly, "for this, for loving me, for being brave enough to risk scandal and judgment for the possibility of happiness. You've given me more than I ever deserved." "We gave each other everything," Vivien corrected, covering his hand with her own. "And we'll give our child a home filled with love rather than propriety, with honesty rather than pretense, with the knowledge that some things are worth fighting for." Their daughter was born 7 months later, after a labor that left Henry pacing the halls of Whitmore Hall like a caged animal, until Charlotte finally ordered him to sit down before he wore a path in the expensive carpets. When the midwife finally emerged to announce that both mother and baby were healthy, he practically ran to Vivien's side. She looked exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. "Meet your daughter, Henry," she said softly, and when she pulled back the blanket to reveal the baby's face, Henry felt his heart expand in ways he hadn't known were possible. The baby, Charlotte Eleanor Whitmore, named after Henry's sister and Vivien's late mother, had dark hair like her mother and what promised to be her father's dark eyes. She was perfect and tiny and absolutely miraculous, a living testament to everything they had overcome to build their life together. "She's beautiful," Henry whispered, afraid to speak too loudly and disturb the sleeping infant, "just like her mother." "She's going to be strong," Vivien predicted, gazing at their daughter with fierce love. "She'll have to be, growing up as the daughter of the Duke and Duchess of Whitmore, but she'll also know what it means to be loved without conditions, to be valued for who she is rather than who society expects her to be. And she'll know that her parents' love story started with scandal and defiance and the kind of passion that refused to be contained by propriety," Henry added. "So if she ever wants to follow her heart, rather than society's rules, she'll have a pretty good precedent to point to." Vivien laughed softly, careful not to wake the baby. "I can only imagine the trouble she'll cause when she's older. She'll probably give us grey hair before we're 40. I can't wait," Henry replied honestly, and he meant it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever scandals their daughter might create, whatever storms they would face together, he knew with absolute certainty that they would weather them as they had weathered everything else, with love, with partnership, with the understanding that some things were worth any price. The christening of Charlotte Eleanor Whitmore was attended by everyone who mattered in their world. Lord and Lady Pemberton, the Dowager Duchess who had become an honorary grandmother, Charlotte and Lord Hartley with their own announcement of an impending arrival, and dozens of others who had supported them through scandal and celebration alike. Even some who had initially condemned their match appeared, drawn by curiosity or genuine change of heart, or simply the social power that the Duke and Duchess of Whitmore now wielded. Arthur Coldwell was notably absent, though his name came up briefly when Charlotte mentioned seeing his wife at a shop, looking thin and unhappy. "I heard he's deeply in debt again," she reported with something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but wasn't far from it either. "Turns out that merchant dowry wasn't enough to sustain his spending habits. But apparently divorce is out of the question, so they're stuck making each other miserable." "I'm grateful every day that I escaped that fate," Vivien said quietly, holding her daughter close. "Even the scandal was worth it to avoid a lifetime of that kind of unhappiness." "The scandal made you interesting," the Dowager Duchess declared from her seat by the window. "Proper marriages are dreadfully boring. Give me a love story with obstacles and passion any day. Makes for much better conversation at tea." As the sun set over Whitmore Hall that evening, Henry stood at the window of the nursery, watching Vivien rock their daughter to sleep. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so achingly beautiful, that he had to commit it to memory. The golden light painting them both in warm tones, the soft melody Vivien hummed, the complete peace on her face as she gazed at their child. This was what mattered, he thought. Not titles or propriety or society's approval, but moments like these, love like this, family like this. Everything else was just noise, easily ignored when compared to the symphony of happiness they had created together. "Come to bed," Vivien said softly once the baby was settled in her cradle. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new adventures, new opportunities to scandalize someone." Henry crossed to her and pulled her into his arms, grateful as always for her presence, her strength, her absolute refusal to be anything less than herself. "I love you," he said, the words as necessary as breathing. "Today, tomorrow, always." "Always," she agreed. And when she kissed him, it tasted like promise and hope, and the kind of forever that only exists when two people choose each other over and over again, regardless of the cost. Outside, London continued its endless cycle of gossip and scandal and judgment. But inside Whitmore Hall, in rooms filled with love and laughter, and the sound of a baby's contented sigh, none of that mattered at all. Because sometimes the greatest rebellion is simply choosing happiness. And sometimes the most radical act is loving someone so completely that society's rules pale in comparison to the truth of what you've built together. Henry and Vivien had learned that lesson the hard way, through scandal and struggle, and the kind of challenges that would have broken lesser connections. But they had emerged stronger, their love tempered by fire until it was unbreakable. And as they stood together watching their daughter sleep, surrounded by everything they had fought for and everything they had built, they knew with absolute certainty that every moment of struggle had been worth it. Because this love, this family, this life they had created in defiance of expectation, this was everything, and it was more than enough. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this journey through Henry and Vivien's love story. If you enjoyed hearing about their scandalous romance and triumphant happiness, we would be absolutely delighted if you could take just a moment to subscribe to our channel, Echoes of Romance. Your subscription helps us bring you more beautiful love stories that celebrate passion over propriety and happiness over duty. We'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Did Henry's declaration at the dinner party make your heart race? Were you rooting for them through the scandal? Do you have your own stories of choosing love over society's expectations? Share with us. We read every comment and cherish your engagement with these tales. And please, if this story touched your heart, give us a like and activate those notifications so you never miss when we share our next romantic adventure. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue creating content that celebrates love in all its forms. Until next time, may you always choose passion over propriety, and may your own love story be filled with the kind of devotion that defies convention. Thank you for being part of the Echoes of Romance family.